When you look at motorsport today, it feels global. Formula One races in Bahrain, Singapore, and Miami. Le Mans cars are built in Germany, Italy, Japan, and the United States. Drivers come from Australia, the Netherlands, Mexico, and even Canada. So at first glance, motorsport feels like a sport that belongs to the entire world. But if you start tracing the origins of the teams, the rules, the races, and even the technology behind the cars, something strange starts to happen. Everything somehow leads back to just two countries, Great Britain and France. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about Formula One, endurance racing, rally, or even grassroots motorsport. Sooner or later, the trail leads back to those same two countries. And that raises a really interesting question. Why? Why did these two countries become the center of the motorsport universe? To answer that question, you have to go all the way back to the moment when racing itself was first invented. And that story begins in France. France in the late 1800s was obsessed with one thing and one thing only, the automobile. At the time, cars were not yet a normal object. They were an experiment, a strange mechanical invention that people weren't quite sure would even work. But French engineers and industrialists were fascinated by it. Companies like Bernard, Peugeot, and Renault were building machines that had never existed before. And the best way to prove your machine worked wasn't advertising, it was competition. If you could build a car that was faster, more reliable, or more advanced than your rivals, the entire country would know. And so the French decided to do something that had never been done before. They organized a race. In July of 1894, a Parisian newspaper company called Le Petit Journal announced a challenge. They called it a competition for horseless carriages. The event would run from Paris to Rouen, a distance of about 126 kilometers or roughly 78 miles. More than 100 vehicles signed up to attempt this journey, and these vehicles were wildly different. Some ran on gasoline engines, some ran on steam, one even attempted to run on compressed air. Imagine standing on a rural road in France in 1894 and watching this convoy of strange machines trying to figure out how to move forward without horses. By the time the race ended, the winner was a gasoline-powered car built by Bernard and Levasseur. Average speed was around 19 kilometers per hour, which today is barely faster than a bicycle. But at the time, it was revolutionary. What mattered wasn't the speed. What mattered was the realization that competition could push technology forward. And France had just accidentally invented motorsport. But the French weren't done, because a few years later, they invented something else that would define racing forever. The first ever Grand Prix. In 1906, the Automobile Club de France organized what would widely be considered by many historians as the first ever true Grand Prix. The race took place on public roads near the city of Le Mans. The first circuit itself was enormous, a 103-kilometer loop that drivers had to complete 12 times across 2 days of racing. Put that into perspective, modern Formula One circuits are usually around 5 kilometers long. This track was 20 times that size. 32 cars entered the race, only 11 finished. The winner was Ferenc Ziz, driving for Renault, with an average speed of just over 100 kilometers per hour. That might not sound particularly fast today, but imagine driving on narrow, rural roads in 1906 at those speeds with almost no safety equipment at all. No seatbelt, no helmet, just pure will and ambition. There were some other races at the time that were claiming the right to be known as the first Grand Prix, so this race was later renamed to the 9th Grand Prix de l'Automobile Club de France, or the 9th Grand Prix of the French Automobile Club. What the French created here wasn't just another race. They created a structure, a governing body, a set of technical rules, a national Grand Prix, and that same format is still the backbone of modern motorsport. But while France were inventing the structure of racing, Britain was about to create something even more powerful, an entire racing industry. Ironically, Great Britain didn't dominate motorsport very early. In fact, initially, Great Britain was kind of behind. For years, the country had strict laws regulating automobiles, including a famous Red Flag Act, which required someone to walk ahead of a car waving a warning flag that a car was behind and in pursuit. Because of that, France, Germany, and Italy developed racing culture much earlier than the UK. But by the 1950s and 1960s, something unexpected began happening in England. During the Second World War, a large number of engineers were concentrated in the area now known as Motorsport Valley. They were tasked primarily with constructing light and fast-weight aircraft fit for war. At the end of the war, however, the engineers who were now unemployed remained in the area and over time got to work on building race cars instead of aircraft. Small racing teams started appearing in a region stretching through Oxfordshire, Northamptonshire, and Buckinghamshire. Within about 50 miles of Silverstone, thousands of companies began specializing in racing technology. Today, 80% of the world's top motorsport engineers reside in this stretch of land between Thames Valley and the West Midlands. Engine builders, carbon fiber manufacturers, aerodynamics experts, suspension engineers, all the likes. Today, more than 4,000 motorsport-related businesses operate in this region. Nearly 40,000 engineers work there. If you're designing a Formula One car, chances are extremely high that at least some of the components were developed within this tiny slice of England. And there's one piece of technology that accelerated this entire ecosystem, an engine that completely changed Formula One. Keith Duckworth and Mike Costin, the co-founders of Cosworth, created the company in 1958 in a little shop in London, England. In 1967, a British engineering company called Cosworth introduced an engine called the DFV V8, with DFV standing for double four-valve. The engine was a 90-degree, 2,993cc V8 with a bore stroke of 85.67 by 64.897 millimeters, producing over 400 brake horsepower from the start, reaching 510 brake horsepower at 11,200 RPM by the end of its Formula One career. The DFV has three major upgrades over its life in the top formula, with the development of the first DFY and then the DFC, followed by a major redesign to produce the final DFR type. The first team to use it was Lotus, driven by the legendary Jim Clark. At the 1967 Dutch Grand Prix, the car debuted and immediately established dominance over competitors. But the real revolution wasn't performance, it was accessibility. For the first time, smaller independent teams could buy a competitive Formula One engine off the shelf. The DFB costed around 7,500 euros, which made it dramatically cheaper than developing your own engine program. Over the next 15 years, the Cosworth DFV would win over 155 Formula One races. Suddenly, dozens of teams could enter the sport. And where were most of those teams based? England. Because the engines, the engineers, and the suppliers were already there. And while Great Britain became the engineering powerhouse of motorsport, France quietly created the most legendary race in the world. In 1923, the Western Automotive Club in France created a race that was meant to ask and answer one simple question. Not which car was the fastest, but which car could survive. The event became known as the 24 Hours of Le Mans. The event, held on the 26th and 27th of May in 1923, was ran through the public roads around Le Mans, and at the time, the circuit measured 17 kilometers. In the early days, the race was dominated by Italian, British, and French drivers, with teams such as Bugatti, Bentley, and Alfa Romeo leading the charge. The first ever 24 Hours of Le Mans, and that race was won by Frenchmen André Lagache and René Nab, piloting the 3-liter Chenard and Walker sport car of the 1900s over 128 laps, which equates to about 1,350 miles of driving. Manufacturers quickly realized that winning this race meant something more and far bigger than just a trophy. It meant proving your engineering could survive the most brutal endurance test imaginable. The race had a 10-year hiatus as a result of the Second World War and quickly picked back up in 1949, following a renewed interest in motorsports by automobile companies. Over the years, various car manufacturers and drivers have had success and ultimately found a home in Le Mans. The Circuit de la Salle became the stomping ground of many major players in the endurance automotive world. Companies like Ferrari, Aston Martin, Mercedes-Benz, and Jaguar all began competing more consistently in the race. Cars were getting faster and more aerodynamic, and much of the design language that was incorporated into these cars of the early days can still be seen in cars today. The growing use of technology in order to power cars and generate wins became the hallmark of not just the 24 hours of Le Mans, but of motorsport writ large. It was no longer just about winning. It was about advancing society forward. Races like this were just a safe playground for companies to put their ideas to the test. Today, the 24 Hours of Le Mans is a motorsport endurance race in which 3 classes of car compete: LMP, LMP2, and LMGT3. Each class will eventually crown its own winner, but there is a 4th prize for the winner of the entire race, which often ends up going to the hypercar class. The 13.626 kilometer long track on which the 24 Hours of Le Mans is held every year is called the Circuit de la Salle. The circuit itself is a mixture of public roads and dedicated racing sections, featuring 38 turns in total, 18 left-hand turns and 20 right-hand turns. It includes 4 long straights in which drivers can reach speeds of up to 340 kilometers per hour, or 210 miles per hour. The race itself still reflects the same idea that launched the first French races in the 1890s. Competition that drives innovation, that drives more competition, that drives even more innovation. Despite everything that you've heard so far, there is still one final reason that France sits at the top of the pedestal in the history of motorsports. At first, it was called the Association Internationale des Automobiles Clubs Reconnus, or International Association of Recognized Automobile Clubs. But after the Second World War, it was renamed to the Fédération Internationale d'Automobile, or the International Federation of Automobiles, otherwise known as the FIA. Headquartered in Paris with offices in London and Geneva, the FIA consists of 245 member organizations in 149 countries around the globe. Today, the FIA governs nearly every major racing championship on Earth: Formula One, the World Endurance Championship, and even World Rally Championship. The FIA headquarters are still located in Paris. The World Motorsport Council, or the WMSC, has the decision-making responsibility for all motorsport the FIA governs and sanctions. It convenes at least 3 times a year to decide on rules and regulations proposed to it by the commissions and committees that have direct responsibility of the various disciplines and championships, which means the rule book that defines global motorsport is still written in France. So when you take a step back and look at motorsport from a holistic perspective, it becomes very clear why so much of its history is tied to 2 major countries: England and France. France invented the competition, created the Grand Prix, and even built the governing bodies and traditions, many of which can still be seen today. But England built the engineering machine that powers modern racing: the teams, the suppliers, the technology. One country created the culture of motorsport, while the other perfected the craft of building race cars. And together, England and France created the foundation that the entire sport still runs on today, even if the cars now race all over the world. Again, I'd like to thank you guys for watching this video. If you found it was interesting, please let me know down in the comments what the most interesting part was. And also, please let me know about any improvements that I can make to the formatting of this video or these kinds of videos. As you can see, I very much like to stay in the niche of motorsport and everything that it concerns itself with. So any critiques or opinions that you guys have, please let me know. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.